Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The Oakwood Apartments weren't anyone's first choice of residence. Built in the 1920s, the six-story structure bore its age like an old boxer who'd seen too many fights. Proud but battered, with a certain dignity in its decay. The brick facade had darkened over decades of city grime, and the windows, tall and narrow, seemed to peer out at the world with suspicious eyes. But for someone on a project manager's salary at a mid-tier tech firm, it offered what I needed most: affordability and solitude. My name is Ryan Hughes, and I'd chosen apartment 4C specifically for its corner location, away from the building's more populated sections. The rent was reasonable enough to raise questions, but I'd attributed that to the building's quirks: the radiators that clanked like imprisoned spirits, the windows that whistled with every breeze, the elevator that worked according to its own inscrutable schedule. The hallways existed in a perpetual twilight, the ancient fluorescent fixtures casting more shadows than light. The wallpaper, a faded pattern of geometric shapes, had begun peeling at the corners, revealing layers of previous decades beneath. The carpet, once burgundy but now an indeterminate shade of brown, muffled footsteps in a way that made every passing resident seem like a ghost. Mrs. Whitaker was part of the building's character, as much a fixture as the brass mailboxes in the lobby or the cracked marble stairs. I'd see her every morning and evening, standing at the hallway's end window, her small frame silhouetted against the watery light. She'd been there so long that other residents spoke of her as if she were part of the building's original architecture. When I first moved in, struggling with boxes of computer equipment and office supplies, she'd watched me with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge. Her warning had come without preamble or introduction. "Be careful in there," she'd said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "They like new energy, fresh minds. You'll see them soon enough." I'd laughed it off, the way you laugh at a child's ghost story or an old wives' tale. The tech industry had trained me to trust in logic, in the measurable and provable. Strange warnings from elderly neighbors didn't fit into that worldview. The apartment itself was larger than it had any right to be for the price, a sprawling two-bedroom with high ceilings and deep closets. The previous tenant had left abruptly, according to the building manager, though he'd been vague about the details. I'd been too excited about the bargain to ask too many questions. Those first few weeks, I'd attributed the apartment's peculiarities to its age. The way shadows seemed to linger in corners long after they should have been dispelled by light. The subtle temperature drops in certain areas, particularly near the bedroom door. The feeling, growing stronger each day, that the spaces behind me were never quite as empty as they should be. Bytesphere. Technologies occupied the gleaming upper floors of the Morton building, its glass walls reflecting the city's perpetual movement like an endless mirror. As technical project manager, I had a corner workspace that looked out over downtown's concrete canyons. The office embodied modern corporate aesthetics: open floor plans, collaborative spaces, and lighting designed to eliminate any hint of shadow or gloom. Everything was engineered to project efficiency, transparency, and rational thought. The day it all began started normally enough. I spent the morning in budget meetings watching PowerPoint slides blur together while executives debated cloud infrastructure costs. Wei Chen from engineering sent me his usual sarcastic Slack messages throughout, making subtle jokes about management buzzwords that kept me from completely losing my mind. Wei had been at Bytesphere longer than anyone else in our division, his technical brilliance matched only by his complete disregard for corporate hierarchy. We were in his cube later that afternoon, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of empty energy drink cans and sticky notes covered in cryptic code fragments. The deployment schedule for our new security features was already 3 weeks behind, and Wei was explaining why adding more developers wouldn't help. "It's like trying to make a baby in 1 month by getting 9 women pregnant," he said, spinning lazily in his chair. "Some things just take time." That's when I saw it, the first glimpse of what would become my new reality. At the far end of the office, behind the glass wall of conference room C, stood a figure. At first my brain tried to categorize it as a colleague, maybe someone from accounting or HR that I didn't know well. But something about it was fundamentally wrong. The shape was human-sized but somehow incomplete, like a three-dimensional shadow given substance. The overhead LED panels, designed to eliminate any dark corners, seemed to bend around it, creating a pocket of darkness that defied the laws of physics. It stood completely motionless, oriented toward us despite having no discernible features. The air around it appeared to ripple slightly, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. When I turned my head for a direct look, it vanished between one blink and the next. The conference room showed only its usual corporate sterility. Whiteboard covered in fading diagrams, ergonomic chairs arranged around the polished table, motivational posters proclaiming the importance of synergy and innovation. But something had changed. The space where the figure had stood seemed darker somehow, as if that patch of reality had been permanently altered by its presence. "You okay?" we asked, noticing my fixed stare. "You look like you've seen the ghost of Project Deadline's past." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the chill that had settled into my bones. "Just tired. These deployment schedules are melting my brain." But throughout the day, the incident kept replaying in my mind. Worse, I started catching glimpses of similar movements in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that disappeared when directly observed, like those deep-sea creatures that can only be seen by looking slightly away from them. They gathered in the spaces between cubicles, hovered near the emergency exits, clustered around the break room during quiet hours. By evening, my neck ached from the constant turning, and my eyes burned from trying to focus on things that refused to be seen. The office's familiar landscape of computers, desks, and meeting spaces had become a theater of shadows, each corner potentially harboring something that shouldn't exist. The shadows followed me home like unwanted companions on the evening commute. My apartment building's familiar silhouette loomed against the darkening sky, its aged brick facade seeming to absorb what little daylight remained. The lobby's marble floors, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, reflected the flickering fluorescent lights in ways that created moving shadows where none should exist. Mrs. Whitaker stood at her usual post by the hallway window, but something about her posture was different. She turned as I approached, her eyes sharp with recognition. For a moment I thought I saw something dark move behind her, a deeper shadow within the twilight of the corridor, but it disappeared when she stepped toward me. My apartment felt different that night. The high ceilings and spacious rooms that had initially attracted me now seemed oppressive, too large for comfort, with too many dark corners and undefined spaces. The shadows gathered in doorways and along walls, more substantial than regular darkness had any right to be. They possessed a weight, a presence that regular shadows lacked, as if they were made of something thicker than mere absence of light. Sleep became an exercise in endurance. Each night I'd lie in bed watching the interplay of streetlight and shadow on my ceiling, trying to convince myself that the darker patches weren't slowly expanding, weren't taking on shapes that suggested awareness and intent. The shadows seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, like a heartbeat just slightly out of sync with my own. During my morning shower, I noticed the water running colder than usual, creating patterns of steam that seemed to coalesce into vaguely human shapes before dissipating. The bathroom mirror showed brief glimpses of movement behind my reflection, dark figures that disappeared when I turned to look. Even my morning coffee tasted different, as if something had leached the warmth from it before it reached my lips. At work, the sightings increased in both frequency and boldness. The figures no longer confined themselves to distant corners or reflective surfaces. They would stand in doorways during meetings, hover near my desk during conference calls, gather in small groups by the water cooler like dark parodies of office social interaction, always just at the edge of vision, always disappearing when directly observed, but growing more numerous with each passing day. Way noticed my deteriorating condition, the dark circles under my eyes, my jumpiness, the way I'd sometimes stop mid-sentence to stare at apparently empty spaces. During a late afternoon code review, he finally confronted me about it. "Look," he said, closing his laptop with unusual seriousness, "I've seen burnout before. Hell, I've lived it. But this is different. You're not just tired, you're scared of something." I wanted to tell him everything, about the shadows that weren't shadows, about the growing certainty that I was being watched, studied, evaluated, about how the darkness seemed to follow me now, how it waited in corners and doorways, patient as a predator. about the growing fear that my grip on reality was slowly slipping away. But how could I explain something I barely understood myself? How could I describe the way the shadows moved with purpose? How they seemed to communicate in a language of darkness and cold? How they were slowly but surely closing in, each day bringing them closer, making them bolder? That evening, returning to my apartment felt like walking into a trap. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the ancient carpet swallowing my footsteps in a way that made me feel disconnected from reality. The shadows in the corners had grown denser, more purposeful, like gathering storm clouds before a tempest. Mrs. Whitaker was waiting by my door. She stood there like a sentinel, her small frame somehow commanding the entire hallway. The usual fluorescent lights had dimmed to almost nothing, creating a tunnel of darkness with her pale figure at its center. Her eyes, when they met mine, held a knowledge that made my skin crawl. "They've marked you," she said without preamble, her voice carrying none of its usual quaver. "I can see their touch all over you." I fumbled with my keys, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Whitaker." "Don't lie to me, boy." The sharpness in her voice made me look up. "I've been watching them for 50 years from that window. I know what it looks like when they choose someone." The hallway had grown colder, our breath visible in the dim light. Behind Mrs. Whitaker, the shadows seemed to writhe with barely contained energy, stretching toward us like curious fingers. "They start small," she continued, her eyes never leaving mine. "Quick movements in the corner of your eye, cold spots in rooms that should be warm, the feeling of being watched when you're alone. But it gets worse. They get bolder, closer. They start testing your boundaries, learning your fears." My hands were shaking now, the keys jingling softly in the silence. Every word she spoke resonated with my experiences of the past weeks, giving shape to the nameless dread that had been building inside me. "What are they?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitaker's face softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the pain behind her knowledge. "I don't know what they are, not really. They've been here longer than us, longer than this building, maybe longer than the city itself. They live in the spaces between light and dark, in the moments between sleeping and waking. And they feed. Feed on what? On fear, on hope, on the very essence of what makes us human." She reached out suddenly, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. Her hand was ice cold. "They'll drain you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but an empty shell that goes through the motions of living." The shadows behind her had grown more agitated, swirling in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. The temperature had dropped further, and the light fixtures were now barely functioning, creating more darkness than illumination. "How do you know all this?" I asked, fighting the urge to run. Her grip tightened on my wrist. "Because I've seen it happen before. To my husband first 40 years ago, then to others in the building. Some disappeared completely, others—" She glanced down the hallway toward the apartments that always seemed to be vacant. Others stayed, but they weren't really here anymore. Just empty vessels going through the motions of life. Mrs. Whitaker insisted on coming into my apartment, moving with a purposefulness that belied her age. The moment we crossed the threshold, the air grew thick with tension, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. The shadows in the corners seemed to pulse with awareness, acknowledging her presence. "They're stronger here than I thought," she muttered, surveying my living room with critical eyes. "You've let them establish too many anchors." The room looked different through her presence, as if her knowledge somehow illuminated things I'd been blind to. Dark patches clung to the walls like oil stains, concentrated especially heavily around mirrors and doorways. The ceiling corners harbored deeper shadows than the available light could explain. "Anchors?" I asked, watching as she moved methodically through the space, her hands hovering over certain areas as if testing the air. Places where they've worn thin the barrier between their world and ours. She stopped near my bedroom doorway, her face grimacing. "This is the worst spot. You've been having nightmares, haven't you? Seeing things in the dark? Feeling watched while you sleep?" I nodded, remembering the countless nights I'd lain awake, watching shadows move across my ceiling with terrible purpose. "What are they trying to do?" "They want in." She turned to face me, her eyes reflecting a knowledge that seemed to transcend ordinary human experience. "Completely in. Right now they can only manifest partially, in shadows and darkness. but they're looking for a way to cross over entirely. And they need vessels. Human vessels. The temperature in the apartment had dropped significantly. My breath came out in visible puffs and the windows had begun to fog over. In the kitchen, I could hear the faucet dripping with an oddly arrhythmic pattern, like some kind of code. "You've seen this before," I said. It wasn't a question. Many times. She moved to my couch, sitting down with the weariness of someone carrying a heavy burden. "The first was my Harold back in '73. He started seeing them just like you. Said they would watch him from the corners, follow him to work. I thought it was stress, maybe early dementia." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "Until I started seeing them too. But by then it was too late. The lights flickered, and for a moment the shadows seemed to stretch toward us, reaching with elongated fingers before retreating again." Mrs. Whitaker didn't react, as if she'd seen it all before. "What happened to him?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "He changed. Gradually at first, just seemed tired all the time, distant. Then he started talking about how beautiful they were, how they'd shown him things, secrets about the universe that humans weren't meant to know." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with old pain. "The last night he told me he understood everything now, that they'd chosen him for something special. The next morning his body was still there, going through the motions of life, but Harold was gone. Whatever looked out through his eyes wasn't my husband anymore." Mrs. Whitaker's preparation was methodical, born from decades of observation and bitter experience. She sent me to gather specific items from her apartment while she began drawing strange symbols near my doorways and windows with a piece of white chalk that seemed to gleam unnaturally in the dimming light. Her apartment was a revelation, a fortress against darkness. Salt lines traced every threshold. Mirrors were carefully covered with intricate patterns, and dozens of small electric lights created overlapping pools of illumination that left no room for shadows to gather. The air smelled of sage and something older, more primal. "Bring the red box from under my bed," she called after me. "And whatever you do, don't look directly at any shadows you see. They're stronger when you acknowledge them." The box was heavy, made of dark wood with brass fittings that were polished to a mirror shine. As I lifted it, I heard something inside shift and click, like mechanical parts settling into place. The shadows in her apartment seemed to recoil from it as I passed. Back in my apartment, the transformation was already visible. Mrs. Whitaker's symbols covered every surface, creating complex geometric patterns that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. She had pushed all my furniture to the walls, clearing a space in the center of the living room. "They're angry," she said, taking the box from my hands. "Can you feel it? The air's getting thicker." She was right. The atmosphere had become almost syrupy, making each movement feel like swimming through heavy water. The temperature had dropped further, and frost patterns had begun forming on my windows. Impossible for early autumn, yet there they were, creating elaborate fractals that seemed to form and reform into faces I didn't want to recognize. "What's in the box?" I asked, watching as she placed it carefully in the center of the cleared space. "Tools." She opened it with reverence, revealing an assortment of objects that looked simultaneously ancient and dangerous. Crystals that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Bundles of herbs I didn't recognize. Small bottles filled with liquids of impossible colors. And what appeared to be a very old book bound in some material I couldn't identify. "My Harold wasn't just a victim," she explained, beginning to arrange the items in a precise pattern. "He was a researcher, obsessed with the boundaries between worlds. He spent years studying them, learning their patterns, their weaknesses. Everything in this box represents decades of his work, before they took him." The shadows had retreated to the furthest corners of the apartment, but there was something deliberate about their withdrawal. They seemed to be gathering, consolidating, preparing for something. The air hummed with tension, like the moment before a lightning strike. "They're not just watching anymore," Mrs. Whitaker said, her voice tight with concern. "They're gathering, more than I've ever seen in one place." She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting a deep worry. "They want you badly. Something about you has drawn them in unusual numbers." The ritual began as night fell completely. Mrs. Whitaker had arranged 7 candles in a specific pattern around the room, their flames burning with an unnaturally steady light. despite the increasingly agitated air currents in the apartment. The book from her box lay open before her, its pages covered in text that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. "Whatever happens," she said, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before, "stay inside the salt circle. The symbols will hold them back, but only if you don't break the boundary." The shadows had continued their strange retreat, pulling back to create a ring of darkness around us that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. The temperature had dropped so low that ice crystals were forming on the walls, creating patterns that mimicked the chalk symbols Mrs. Whitaker had drawn. She began to read from the book, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that made my ears buzz. The words weren't in any language I recognized, but they seemed to carry weight, making the air vibrate with each syllable. The candle flames responded, dancing in perfect synchronization with her words. That's when the shadows began to move. They didn't creep or slide as they had before. They surged forward like a tide of liquid darkness, their movements suggesting shapes that shouldn't exist in our reality. Faces formed and dissolved in the writhing mass, some almost human, others decidedly not. The temperature dropped further, turning our breath into clouds of white vapor. "They're angry," Mrs. Whitaker said between verses, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding us. "They've never been confronted like this before. Usually they take their time, wearing down their victims slowly. But now..." A sound filled the apartment, starting as a low hum but quickly building into something that resembled both whispers and screams. The shadows began taking more defined shapes, tall, elongated figures that moved with a terrible fluid grace. Their forms suggested humanity while simultaneously denying it, like sketches of people done by something that had only heard descriptions of human beings. The closest figure stepped forward, its movement making my eyes water from trying to track its impossible angles. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its head brushing against my ceiling without seeming to notice. When it spoke, the words came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Give him to us." Mrs. Whitaker's response was immediate and fierce. She threw something from one of her bottles into the nearest candle flame, creating a burst of light that momentarily drove the shadows back. "You have no right to him," she declared. "No right to any of us." The shadow being's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "Right?" The word echoed through my bones. We were here before rights, before words, before light. More figures had emerged from the darkness, their forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. They moved in ways that denied physics, their limbs bending at impossible angles, their heads rotating completely around as they studied us from every angle. "He invited us," another voice whispered, this one sounding disturbingly like my own. "Every time he looked for us, every time he acknowledged us." He opened the door a little wider. The shadows continued their assault, pressing against Mrs. Whitaker's protective circle with increasing force. The air itself seemed to thicken and darken, making each breath feel like drowning in cold molasses. The candlelight flickered frantically, creating a strobing effect that made the shadow beings appear to move in jerky, stop-motion sequences. "Don't listen to their voices," Mrs. Whitaker warned, her hands steady as she pulled more items from her box. "They'll use everything they've learned about you, every fear, every doubt, every moment of weakness." As if in response, the shadows began to shift, taking on familiar forms. I saw my father as he looked before the cancer took him, my childhood friend who died in a car accident, even Wei from the office, all rendered in living darkness, all wearing expressions of terrible understanding. "You've felt it, haven't you?" The shadow wearing Wei's face spoke with perfect mimicry of his voice. "The emptiness of your existence, the meaningless routines. We can show you so much more." It reached out with a hand that seemed to extend forever, fingers elongating like smoke in wind. "Let us in. Let us show you what lies beyond the veil of your limited perception." Mrs. Whitaker's response was to throw a handful of some crystalline substance into the air. Where it fell, the shadows hissed and recoiled, their forms momentarily disrupting like static on an old TV screen. "They're liars," she said firmly. "Everything they show you is twisted, corrupted by their nature." The largest shadow being, the one that had first spoken, moved forward again. Its form had grown more substantial, more terrifying in its clarity. What I had first taken for a featureless face now showed suggestions of eyes, not human eyes, but deep wells of absolute darkness that seemed to pull at my consciousness like black holes. We do not lie, it resonated, its voice making the windows vibrate in their frames. We reveal. We illuminate through darkness. Your kind has always sought us, drawn to the truths you sense behind the thin veil of your reality. The temperature dropped so low that the remaining moisture in the air began to crystallize, creating a fine snow that fell in defiance of physics. The shadow beings pressed closer, their forms merging and separating like oil on water. The protective circle began to frost over, the salt lines crackling with ice. Mrs. Whitaker opened her book to a new page, her voice rising in a chant that made my teeth ache. The candles flared in response, their flames turning an impossible blue-white that cast no shadows at all. For a moment, the darkness retreated, but then... Enough of this, a new voice spoke, and this time it was Harold's voice, Mrs. Whitaker's long-lost husband. A figure stepped forward from the mass of shadows, wearing his face and form with terrible accuracy. "Marian, my dear, you've fought long enough. It's time to understand what I learned, what they showed me." For the first time, I saw Mrs. Whitaker's resolve waver. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the book, her voice catching on the ancient words. The shadow wearing Harold's face moved closer to the circle, its movements a perfect recreation of what must have been his living mannerisms. Mrs. Whitaker's hands shook harder, tears freezing on her cheeks in the supernatural cold. "Marian," it said again, softer now, intimate. "Remember how we used to study them together? All those nights of research, of wondering. I found the answers, my love. I found what lies beyond all this." It gestured at the room, at reality itself. "Let me show you. Let me show both of you." The other shadow beings had drawn back, forming a dark amphitheater around this terrible reunion. Their forms rippled with anticipation, like audience members awaiting the climax of a performance they'd orchestrated. "It's not him," I said, my voice hoarse from the cold. "Mrs. Whitaker, you know it's not really him." "Oh, but I am." The shadow herald smiled, the expression too wide, too knowing. "I'm more Harold than I ever was in life. They showed me everything, the patterns behind reality, the truth behind consciousness, the beauty of the void." It reached out one hand, stopping just short of the protective circle. "Join me, Marian. You've been alone so long." Mrs. Whitaker's voice cracked as she tried to continue the chant. The candles flickered dangerously, their protective light wavering. Ice continued to creep across the floor, approaching the salt line from all directions. That's when I noticed something crucial, a pattern in the ice crystals forming on my walls. They weren't random. They were creating the same symbols Mrs. Whitaker had drawn earlier, but inverted wrong somehow. The shadows weren't just attacking us directly. They were corrupting the very protections meant to hold them back. "The symbols," I shouted, pointing. "They're turning them against us." Mrs. Whitaker snapped out of her trance, her grief transforming into anger. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You don't get to use him against me. Not again. Not ever again." She reached into her box one final time and pulled out something that made all the shadows recoil simultaneously. A small, ornate mirror wrapped in what looked like copper wire and covered in tiny engravings. "Harold made this," she said, her voice steady now. "The real Harold. Before you took him, he knew what you were, what you wanted, and he created this to stop you." The shadow herald's face contorted, the pleasant mask slipping to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. "You cannot stop us. We are eternal. We are the spaces between moments. The darkness behind closed eyes, the..." Mrs. Whitaker raised the mirror, pointing it directly at the thing wearing her husband's face. The engravings began to glow with an inner light that seemed to pull at the shadows, creating a vortex of darkness centered on the mirror's surface. "No," she said simply. "You're just parasites. And it's time for you to go." The mirror's power was instantaneous and terrible. The shadow creatures began to distort, their forms stretching and twisting as they were pulled toward its surface. The one wearing Harold's face screamed, a sound that existed somewhere between radio static and the cry of a dying star. "You cannot send us back," it howled, its borrowed features melting away to reveal something ancient and utterly alien. "We are already part of him." Mrs. Whitaker's grip on the mirror remained steady. "Then I'll take that part too." She began the chant again, but this time the words seemed to have physical weight. each syllable striking the shadows like bullets. The vortex intensified. I felt it pulling at something inside me, something the shadows had infected without my knowledge. The sensation was like having ice water drawn through my veins. Dark shapes began to peel away from my skin, tendrils of shadow I hadn't even known were there. The temperature in the room plummeted further. The windows cracked from the extreme cold, but their breaking somehow produced no sound. The shadows thrashed and fought, their forms becoming increasingly desperate and bizarre. They tried to escape, to seep into corners or slip beneath doors, but the mirror's pull was relentless. One by one, they were drawn in, their alien screams cutting off abruptly as they vanished into the mirror's depths. The shadow wearing Harold's face was the last to go, its form dissolving into a writhing mass of darkness that fought until the final moment. Then, suddenly it was over. The room was empty of shadows, not just supernatural ones, but normal ones as well. Every surface gleamed as if freshly illuminated. The temperature began to rise immediately, the ice on the windows starting to melt. Mrs. Whitaker lowered the mirror carefully, wrapping it back in its protective cloth. "We need to cleanse the building," she said, her voice businesslike despite her evident exhaustion. "Every floor, every corner. They'll try to find another way in if we don't." We worked through the night, placing protective symbols and salt lines throughout the oak wood. When dawn finally came, it felt different, cleaner somehow, as if the light itself had been purified. I never saw a shadow move wrong again. But sometimes, on very dark nights, I still hear whispers in the spaces between moments, reminding me that some boundaries are thinner than we think. We had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. My wife Lily and I, along with our best friends Mike and Sarah, needed a break. Life had been hectic lately, and a weekend out in nature seemed like the perfect way to unwind. Our campsite was near Serenity Lake, a beautiful spot that Mike had heard about from a colleague at work. The only catch was that it was way off the beaten path. We had to drive an hour and a half down a dusty dirt road just to get there, far away from any main roads or towns. It was late August 1998, and I had just turned 36. The world felt different back then. No smartphones, no constant connection to the outside world. Just us, our camping gear, and the promise of a peaceful weekend away from it all. As we drove down that long, winding dirt road, I couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation creeping in. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The further we went, the more I felt like we were leaving civilization behind. But I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to pre-vacation jitters. The place was amazing when we finally arrived. Tall pines surrounded us, their needles creating a soft carpet underfoot. The air was thick with the scent of sap and wild herbs, and there was a peaceful, quiet feeling that settled over everything like a blanket. It was just what we needed after months of stress and overtime at work. The campsite was also pretty secluded, which we thought was a good thing at first. No neighbors on one side, just a thick forest and no one else around. We could barely make out another campsite through the trees, but it looked empty. Perfect, we thought. We'd have this slice of paradise all to ourselves. We set up our tents with practiced efficiency, Lily and I in one, Mike and Sarah in the other. Mike insisted on bringing his truck with a camper shell, saying it would be more comfortable for him and Sarah to sleep in. We laughed it off, calling him a glamper, but little did we know how crucial that decision would turn out to be. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we got a campfire going. The crackling of the flames and the smell of wood smoke completed the perfect camping atmosphere. We spent that first evening sitting around the fire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The stars came out, more brilliant than I'd ever seen them, unpolluted by city lights. "This is perfect," Anna said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "I can't remember the last time I felt this relaxed." I nodded in agreement, wrapping my arm around her. Looking at Greg and Diane across the fire, I could see the same contentment on their faces. We'd all been friends since college, and these moments together were becoming rarer as our lives got busier. As the fire died down to embers, we decided to turn in for the night. The forest around us had grown eerily quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I zipped up our tent, feeling a sense of security in its flimsy walls that, in hindsight, was completely unfounded. That night, I dreamt of dark shapes moving through the trees, always just at the edge of my vision. I woke with a start, my heart racing, but the quiet breathing of Anna beside me soon calmed me down. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on my mind. The next morning dawned bright and clear. The nightmare faded away in the cheerful light of day, and we set about making breakfast over the campfire. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, mingling with the fresh scent of pine. "So what's the plan for today?" Greg asked, his mouth full of scrambled eggs. "I vote for checking out that lake," Diane said. "It's supposed to be beautiful and I could use a swim." We all agreed, and after cleaning up breakfast, we packed some snacks and headed out. The hike to Serenity Lake took about 20 minutes, following a narrow, overgrown trail that wound through the dense forest. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking presence. "You okay?" Anna asked, noticing my unease. "You seem a bit jumpy." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just not used to being out in nature, I guess. Too much city living." She laughed and squeezed my hand, and I tried to relax, but the feeling of eyes on my back persisted. When we finally broke through the tree line and saw Serenity Lake, all my worries momentarily vanished. The lake was a mirror, perfectly reflecting the blue sky and surrounding mountains. It was breathtakingly beautiful, the kind of view you see on postcards but rarely in real life. We spent hours at the lake, swimming in the cool, clear water, sunbathing on the rocky shore, and acting like kids again. For a while, it felt like we had found our own private paradise. But as the day wore on, I noticed Greg and Diane exchanging worried glances. When I asked what was wrong, Greg pulled me aside. "I don't want to freak anyone out," he said in a low voice, "but I swear I saw someone watching us from the trees earlier. When I looked again, they were gone." I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering my own feelings of being watched. Maybe it was just another hiker? I suggested, not really believing it myself. Greg shrugged, but I could see he was unsettled. "Maybe let's just keep an eye out, okay?" I nodded, and we rejoined the others, trying to act normal. But the carefree mood of the morning had evaporated. As we packed up to head back to the campsite, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows. The walk back to the campsite seemed to take longer, the forest around us suddenly more menacing than mysterious. We were all quieter, more alert. Every snapping twig made us jump. As we approached our campsite, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a silver car parked at the site next to ours, a site that had been empty when we left. And sitting at the picnic table, staring directly at us, was a man. He was average-looking, maybe in his 40s, with close-cropped hair and a lean build. But there was something about him that set my teeth on edge. His eyes followed our every move as we entered our campsite, his gaze unnervingly intense. "Looks like we've got a neighbor," Anna said, trying to sound cheerful. But I could hear the unease in her voice. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I guess we do." As we started preparing dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that our perfect getaway had just taken a dark turn. The man's constant staring was unnerving, and combined with the strange occurrences at the lake, I felt a growing sense of dread. Little did we know, this was only the beginning of the strange and terrifying events that would unfold over the next 24 hours. Our peaceful camping trip was about to turn into a nightmare none of us could have anticipated. As the day progressed, the constant staring from our new neighbor became increasingly difficult to ignore. Greg nudged me and whispered, "You notice how that guy keeps watching us?" I nodded, trying to keep my voice low. "Yeah, it's pretty creepy. Maybe he's just not good with people." We spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, but the weight of the man's gaze was palpable. It felt like he was cataloging our every move, and the once peaceful campsite now felt exposed and vulnerable. As evening approached, something even stranger occurred. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, walked by the man's campsite. Her behavior immediately caught our attention. She moved with a nervous energy, constantly glancing around as if ensuring no one was watching her. Then, in a quick motion that she clearly thought was discreet, she snapped a photo of the man's license plate. Greg, ever the protective one, called out to her. "Hey, you okay? Need any help?" The woman startled like a deer in headlights. She mumbled something unintelligible and hurried away, disappearing into the growing shadows of the forest. We exchanged bewildered looks.
"What was that about?"
Anna asked, her voice tinged with worry. Before we could discuss it further, the camp host arrived, an older woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She made her rounds, checking in with campers. When she reached the man's site, we all tried to eavesdrop without being too obvious. Most of the conversation was too quiet to hear, but we caught fragments that only added to our unease. The man seemed overly interested in the bathhouse, peppering the host with questions about its location, hours, and privacy. As darkness fell, we tried to salvage the evening. We made dinner over the campfire, played some music on a battery-powered radio, and attempted to recapture the carefree spirit of the previous night. But the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Around this time, we noticed the man engaging in behavior that crossed the line from merely odd to downright unsettling. He sat at his picnic table, illuminated by a single weak lantern, mechanically spooning beans from a can into his mouth. His eyes never left our campsite, and there was something almost aggressive about the way he ate, like each bite was an act of defiance. Greg and I shared a glance, torn between nervous laughter at the bizarreness of the situation and genuine concern about what this man's presence might mean. After dinner, we decided a walk might clear our heads. We needed a break from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over our campsite. As we strolled through the campground, we tried to enjoy the night air and the stars peeking through the canopy above. But our conversation inevitably circled back to our strange neighbor and the odd events of the day. On our way back, we spotted the man again, this time near what we assumed was the bathhouse he had been so curious about earlier. He was prowling around the building, shining a flashlight on the doors and windows, his behavior furtive and suspicious. "Okay, that's just wrong," Diane whispered. "Should we say something to the camp host?" We debated our options, but in the end, decided to return to our site. We had no proof he was doing anything illegal, and the thought of confronting him or drawing his attention made us all uncomfortable. Back at the campsite, we huddled around our fire, but the earlier joviality was gone. The shadows beyond the ring of firelight seemed deeper, more menacing. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snapping twig made us jump. "Maybe we should leave in the morning," Anna suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "This whole thing is giving me the creeps." We nodded in agreement. The trip that was supposed to be a relaxing getaway had turned into something tense and uncomfortable. As we doused the fire and retreated to our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the forest, trying to distinguish between the natural noises and anything that might signal approaching danger. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and filled with unsettling dreams. I had no idea then that the true nightmare was yet to begin, that the events of the day were merely a prelude to the terror that awaited us in the dark hours before dawn. I woke suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. The strange man, his constant staring, the weird questions about the bathhouse. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down, telling myself it was just a bad dream. But then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scream, a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream, like a woman in mortal danger. Anna was already awake, sitting up beside me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I nodded, trying to figure out what to do. We listened for a few minutes, but everything was silent again. Maybe it was just some people messing around, I thought. After all, there were other campers here, but it didn't sound like a joke. It sounded real, and it scared me more than I wanted to admit. I was about to get out of the car to look around when I heard something else. Whispering. It was coming from the camper shell of Greg and Diane's truck just a few feet away. I cracked the car door open, trying to be as quiet as possible. I leaned out, straining to hear what they were saying. Then I caught it. "Robert, start the car." It was Greg. His voice was low and urgent. I froze, trying to understand what was going on. "What's happening?" I whispered back. But there was no answer. Just that same urgent whisper, "Start the car now." My heart was racing as I climbed back inside and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and in an instant, Greg and Diane burst out of the camper, running toward us. They jumped into the back seat, slamming the door behind them.
Drive.
Greg gasped, looking more scared than I had ever seen him. I didn't ask questions. I just hit the gas and drove away from the campsite as fast as I could. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow, winding road ahead. Trees whipped past us, their branches seeming to reach out like claws trying to grab the car. After what felt like forever, I finally pulled over on the side of the road. "What happened?" I asked, turning around to look at them. Diane was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. Greg took a deep breath and started to explain. "We woke up to a light coming from the guy's campsite," he said. He was standing there completely naked, shining a flashlight in our direction. I felt a chill go down my spine. "That's not all," Diane added, her voice barely a whisper. "He was doing something disgusting, and he was looking right at our cars while he did it. But that's not even the worst part." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "He started signaling with the flashlight like he was doing Morse code or something. And then across the ravine, this old RV started flashing its headlights back at him." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just some creepy guy, this was something dark and sinister. They were working together, signaling to each other in the middle of the night. I felt my stomach turn as the realization hit me. We weren't just dealing with one strange person. We were caught up in something much worse. "And then," Greg continued, "we heard footsteps around the truck. Someone tapped on our window. That's when Diane screamed and we woke you up." My mind was racing. Who was in the RV? What did they want? Why were they watching us? We decided we needed help. We drove until we found the camp host's trailer and woke her up. She called the police on her satellite phone, but they said they couldn't get out here until morning because of a wildfire nearby. We were on our own for the rest of the night. The camp host advised us to stay in our car and keep the doors locked. As we sat in the car waiting for the sun to rise, I felt a dread like I had never known. Every shadow looked like a person. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Suddenly, a man in a hood appeared right at my window. I flipped on the headlights and he bolted into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. We stayed awake until morning, too scared to sleep. When the sun finally came up, we packed up as fast as we could. The man's car was still there, but now it had blankets hung over the windows like he was hiding something. We didn't stick around to find out what it was. We just got out of there, driving away as fast as we could. Hours later, the police called. They said they questioned the guy, but he claimed he was just showering. The people in the RV denied everything. The police said there was nothing they could do. It was our word against his. As I hung up the phone, I felt a shiver run down my spine. We might have escaped that night, but it felt like the beginning of something much darker. Later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I opened it and my heart stopped. It was a photo of our campsite from the night before, taken from the darkness of the forest. Beneath it, a single message: "We'll be watching." The days following our return from the camping trip were filled with a paranoid unease. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a jolt of fear, expecting to see another message from that unknown number. Anna and I jumped at every unexpected sound in our apartment, and sleep became a luxury we could rarely afford. We tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince ourselves that it was just a group of weird people playing sick jokes, but deep down we knew it was something more sinister. The coordinated signals between the man and the RV, the photographs sent to my phone, it all pointed to something organized and deliberate. A week after we returned, Greg called me in a panic. "Robert," he said, his voice shaking, "someone broke into our house last night." My blood ran cold.
What, are you and Diane okay?
"We're fine, we weren't home," he replied. "But that's not the worst part. They didn't take anything valuable. Instead, they left something." "Left something?" I echoed, dreading the answer. "A can of beans," Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Open on our bedside table. And a note that said, 'We're always closer than you think.'" The implications were terrifying. Whoever these people were, they had followed us home. They knew where we lived, and they could get to us whenever they wanted. We went to the police again, but without concrete evidence of a threat, there was little they could do. They advised us to install security systems and be vigilant, but it felt like empty advice in the face of what we were dealing with. As the weeks passed, strange occurrences continued. Cars we didn't recognize would park outside our homes for hours. We'd catch glimpses of hooded figures watching us from across the street. Once I came home to find my front door unlocked even though I was certain I had locked it when I left. The constant stress began to take its toll. Anna and I started arguing more, the tension of constant fear straining our relationship. Greg and Diane withdrew from us, barely returning our calls. I understood their reaction. Part of me wanted to pretend none of this had ever happened, too. Then, about a month after the camping trip, things escalated. I was walking home from work late one night when I noticed a silver car following me. It was the same make and model as the one at the campsite. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, but the car kept pace with me, always staying a few yards back. As I turned onto my street, the car suddenly accelerated, pulling up alongside me. The window rolled down and I saw the driver. It was him, the man from the campsite. He smiled at me, that same unsettling grin I remembered from that night. "Beautiful evening for a walk, isn't it?" he said casually, as if we were old friends. I stood frozen, unable to speak or move. "You know," he continued, his voice taking on a menacing edge, "you really should be more careful. You never know who might be watching." With that, he drove off, leaving me standing there, shaking with fear and adrenaline. That night, as Anna and I sat in our living room, trying to decide what to do next, my phone buzzed with another message. With trembling hands, I opened it. It was a video this time, clearly taken from inside our apartment. It showed Anna and me, sitting exactly where we were at that moment, from an angle that could only have come from our bookshelf. The message below read, "The game is just beginning. Are you ready to play?" The discovery of the hidden camera in our apartment pushed us over the edge. We couldn't stay there any longer. Within hours, Anna and I had packed essential belongings and checked into a motel on the outskirts of town. We used cash, hoping to avoid leaving an electronic trail. In the dim light of the motel room, we tried to piece together a plan. "We need to go to the FBI," Anna suggested, her voice hoarse from stress. "This is beyond local police now." I nodded, but doubt gnawed at me. Would they believe us? And even if they did, could they protect us from whatever sinister network we'd stumbled into? The next morning, we drove to the nearest FBI field office. The agent who interviewed us, a stern-faced woman named Agent Harding, listened to our story with an impassive expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," she said when we finished, "I understand you're frightened, but without concrete evidence, there's little we can do officially." My heart sank. But then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Off the record, your story fits a pattern we've been seeing. Isolated campgrounds, coordinated stalking, escalating intimidation. We believe it's a network involved in human trafficking, using remote locations to identify and target victims." The revelation hit us like a physical blow. Human trafficking. The pieces started to fit together. The woman photographing the license plate, the signals between campsites, the relentless pursuit. Agent Harding slid a business card across the desk. "I can't officially investigate, but I have contacts who might be able to help. Be careful who you trust." As we left the FBI office, a new determination replaced our fear. We weren't just victims anymore. We were witnesses to something much larger and more horrifying. Over the next few weeks, we moved frequently, never staying in one place for long. We reached out to Greg and Diane, but they had disappeared. Their house stood empty, a for sale sign in the yard. With the help of Agent Harding's contacts, we began to dig deeper into what we'd encountered. We uncovered reports of similar incidents across the country. Campers terrorized, people going missing from remote areas, always with a pattern of strange behavior from other campers beforehand. One night, as we pored over documents in another anonymous motel room, Anna gasped. "Robert, look at this." She pointed to a news article about a missing hiker. The man in the grainy photo was unmistakable. It was the creepy guy from our campsite. He's not just part of it, I realized. He's a victim too. Or he was before they turned him. The scope of what we were dealing with began to dawn on us. This wasn't just a criminal network. It was a systematic operation that turned victims into perpetrators. As we delved deeper, the danger grew. Twice we narrowly escaped men who tried to break into our room. Once we found our car's brake lines cut. Just when it seemed we were running out of options, I received a cryptic email. "If you want answers, return to where it began. Midnight 3 days from now." We knew it was risky, possibly a trap, but we also knew we couldn't run forever. After days of debate and careful planning, we made our decision. As we drove back toward Serenity Lake, the forest seemed to close in around us, darker and more foreboding than before. We were heading back into the heart of our nightmare, unsure if we'd find answers or meet our doom. The campground was deserted when we arrived, an eerie silence hanging over the empty sites. As the clock ticked towards midnight, we waited, every sense on high alert. Then from the darkness a figure emerged. It was the woman we'd seen photographing the license plate. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's so much you need to know." As she began to speak, we realized we were about to uncover the terrifying truth behind the horror that had consumed our lives. The woman introduced herself as Claire, her eyes darting nervously around the empty campground as she spoke. "I've been trying to expose this operation for years," she explained in hushed tones. "But they're always one step ahead." Claire led us deeper into the woods, away from the campsite. We followed cautiously, our nerves on edge. After about 10 minutes of walking, we came to a small clearing where a battered RV stood hidden among the trees. "This is my mobile command center," Claire said, ushering us inside. The interior was crammed with computer equipment, maps, and bulletin boards covered in photos and notes. As Claire began to explain, the horrifying scope of the situation became clear. The network we'd stumbled upon wasn't just involved in human trafficking. It was part of a much larger, more insidious operation. "They call themselves the Watchers," Claire said, pointing to a symbol that appeared in several photos, an eye within a triangle. "They've been operating for decades, using remote locations like this to identify potential targets." She explained that the Watchers didn't just kidnap people, they broke them down psychologically, turning them into willing participants in their twisted schemes. The man we'd seen at the campsite was one such victim, now working to lure in others. "But why?" Anna asked, her voice trembling. "What's the endgame?" Claire's expression darkened. "Power," she said simply. "They have members in every level of society. Law enforcement, government, business. They use the people they break to manipulate and control others in positions of influence." As Claire continued to reveal the extent of the Watchers' reach, a sense of overwhelming dread settled over us. We had uncovered something far more terrifying than we could have imagined. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the woods. Claire's eyes widened in fear. "They've found us," she whispered. We peered out the RV's windows to see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, moving steadily closer. Claire quickly gathered some files and a laptop. "We need to go now," she urged. "There's a hidden trail behind the RV. It leads to a road where I have a car stashed. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." As we slipped out of the RV, the voices of our pursuers grew louder. We ran through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the sound of our own ragged breathing loud in our ears. A shout behind us indicated we'd been spotted. The crack of a gunshot spurred us to run faster, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We burst out of the tree line onto a narrow dirt road. Claire's car, an old sedan, sat hidden under a camouflage tarp. As we raced towards it, more shots rang out. Claire stumbled, crying out in pain. A bullet had grazed her arm. We helped her to the car, our hearts pounding as the sounds of pursuit grew ever closer. As we sped away down the dark road, headlights off to avoid detection, I realized that our lives had irrevocably changed. We were now fugitives hunted by a shadowy organization with seemingly limitless reach. But we also had something they didn't want us to have: information. And as long as we had that, we had a chance to fight back. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, we drove on, uncertain of our destination, but determined to uncover the truth and put an end to the Watchers, no matter the cost. For months, we lived on the run, constantly moving, always looking over our shoulders. Claire's information proved invaluable, helping us stay one step ahead of the Watchers. We reached out to trusted journalists, whistleblowers, and even a few sympathetic government officials, slowly building a network of allies. Our big break came when we managed to decrypt files from Claire's laptop. They contained evidence of the Watchers' operations, including names of high-ranking members and details of their criminal activities. We knew this information could bring down the entire organization, but it also made us bigger targets than ever. We decided to make our stand. Using encrypted channels, we coordinated with our allies to release the information simultaneously, across multiple platforms. News outlets, social media, government agencies, all would receive the evidence at once, making it impossible for the watchers to suppress. The night before our planned release, we holed up in a safe house, tensions high. As midnight approached, we initiated the upload. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then confirmation messages started flooding in. The information was out. The aftermath was explosive. Arrests were made at the highest levels of government and business. The Watchers network began to crumble as members turned on each other, trying to save themselves. But our victory came at a cost. In a final, desperate act, a remnant of the Watchers tracked us down. As dawn broke, we found ourselves surrounded, gunfire peppering the safe house. Claire was hit in the initial volley. Anna and I fought back, using the skills we'd honed over months on the run. In the chaos, I saw a chance to end this once and for all. I made a break for the leader, tackling him as he reloaded. We grappled, trading blows. In a stroke of luck, I managed to disarm him. As I held him at gunpoint, sirens wailed in the distance. Help was coming. In the days that followed, the full extent of the Watchers' operations came to light. The public was shocked by the scale of the conspiracy. Trials began, and the organization that had terrorized us for so long was finally dismantled. Claire survived her wounds and became a key witness in the trials. Greg and Diane were found. They had been in witness protection. Slowly, we all began to rebuild our lives. A year later, Anna and I returned to Serenity Lake. The campground was different now, busier, with new safety measures in place. As we stood by the lake watching the sunset, Anna squeezed my hand. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. I thought about all we'd been through, the nightmares that still plagued us, the paranoia that might never fully go away. But I also thought about the strength we'd found, the evil we'd exposed, the lives we'd saved. "I think this chapter is," I said. "And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As we walked back to our campsite, the forest no longer felt threatening. We had faced our fears, confronted true evil, and come out stronger. Our camping trip from hell had turned into a life-changing odyssey, and while the scars would remain, we had reclaimed our lives and our peace. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as I loaded the last of my bags into the trunk of my weathered sedan. It was June 15th, 2023, and at 28 years old, I was finally embarking on the solo road trip I'd been dreaming about for years. My destination, Seabrook Haven, a quaint coastal town that promised rest, relaxation, and a much-needed break from the relentless grind of city life. As I settled into the driver's seat, a mixture of excitement and nervous energy coursed through my veins. The open road stretched out before me, an invitation to adventure and the unknown. I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp morning air that filtered through the open window. This was it. This was freedom. The first few hours of the drive were nothing short of blissful. I cruised down the highway with my favorite playlist blaring through the speakers, my fingers tapping out the rhythm on the steering wheel. The landscape gradually transformed from urban sprawl to rolling countryside, a patchwork quilt of farmland and forest that seemed to stretch endlessly to the horizon. I made my first stop at a small roadside diner, the kind of place that seems frozen in time. The vinyl booths were cracked and worn, and the air was thick with the smell of coffee and bacon. As I sipped my coffee and devoured a stack of syrupy pancakes, I couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from the locals. "Did you hear about what happened up at the old Miller place?" An elderly man whispered to his companion, his voice barely audible over the clinking of cutlery. "Hush now," the woman across from him hissed, casting a furtive glance in my direction. "We don't talk about that, especially not with outsiders around." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm summer air. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies. Still, as I climbed back into my car and pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The miles ticked by and the sun climbed higher in the sky. I found myself captivated by the changing landscape. Dense forests began to encroach on the road, their ancient trees standing like silent sentinels. The canopy overhead grew thicker, casting dappled shadows across the asphalt. It was beautiful, in a primal sort of way, but there was something about the darkness between the trees that made me uneasy. As the afternoon wore on, I began to feel the fatigue of the long drive setting in. My eyes grew heavy and I found myself yawning more frequently. I knew I should find a place to stop for the night, but something compelled me to press on. Seabrook Haven was calling to me, its siren song growing stronger with each passing mile. It was then that I remembered reading about a scenic overlook somewhere in this area. The travel guide had promised breathtaking views of the forest and surrounding countryside. A quick stop to stretch my legs and take in the view seemed like the perfect way to rejuvenate myself for the final leg of the journey. I spotted the sign for the overlook and carefully navigated my car onto the narrow, winding road that led away from the highway. The pavement soon gave way to gravel, and the trees pressed in even closer, their branches scraping against the sides of my car like grasping fingers. After what felt like an eternity of twists and turns, the road opened up into a small parking area. I pulled in and cut the engine, relishing the sudden silence. As I stepped out of the car, I was immediately struck by the stillness of the air. There were no bird calls, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. I made my way to the edge of the overlook, my footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel. The view was indeed spectacular. Miles of unbroken forest stretched out before me, a sea of green that rippled in the late afternoon breeze. In the distance, I could just make out the glint of sunlight on water, perhaps the ocean near Seabrook Haven. As I stood there, drinking in the view, a movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. I turned my head slowly, half expecting to see a deer or some other woodland creature. Instead, my eyes fell upon a narrow, overgrown path leading into the dense undergrowth. It wasn't marked, and it looked as though it hadn't been used in years. Brambles and vines partially obscured the entrance, but something about it called to me. I hesitated, knowing that wandering off into an unknown forest was probably not the smartest idea. But curiosity got the better of me. After all, what harm could a short walk do? I'd be able to find my way back easily enough. With a deep breath to steel my nerves, I pushed aside the tangle of vegetation and stepped onto the path. The forest seemed to close in around me immediately, the canopy overhead blotting out much of the remaining daylight. The air grew noticeably cooler, and a damp, earthy smell filled my nostrils. I hadn't gone more than a few hundred yards when an overwhelming sense of unease began to creep over me. The silence, which had seemed peaceful at first, now felt oppressive and unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that dozens of unseen eyes were following my every move. I stopped, my heart beginning to race. I turned in a slow circle, peering into the gloom between the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the feeling of being observed only intensified. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast stillness of the forest. "Is anyone there?" No response came, but as the echo of my voice faded away, I became aware of a new sound. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it grew steadily louder. A whisper, carried on the still air in a language I couldn't understand. The words, if they were words at all, seemed to slither and writhe, twisting in on themselves in impossible ways. Panic began to set in. I turned to retrace my steps, but the path behind me had vanished, swallowed up by the encroaching undergrowth. I spun around, searching desperately for any sign of the way I had come. But every direction looked the same, an impenetrable wall of gnarled trunks and twisted branches. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. They pressed in on me, filling my head with their alien cadence. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. If anything, it only grew louder. And then, cutting through the cacophony of whispers, came a new sound. A low guttural growl that sent ice-cold fingers of fear racing down my spine. It was close, too close, and it was moving closer. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and tugging at my clothes. I had no idea which direction I was going, but I knew I had to get away. The growl pursued me, growing louder and more frenzied with each passing second. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I burst through a line of trees and found myself in a small clearing. And there in the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin. Its weathered boards were gray with age, the windows dark and empty like the eye sockets of a skull. The roof sagged ominously, and the porch steps were rotted and broken. But it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. I stumbled up the creaking steps and threw myself against the door. To my surprise, it swung open easily, as if it had been waiting for me. I slammed it shut behind me and leaned against it, gasping for breath. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized that I had made a terrible mistake. The cabin was not empty, and what awaited me inside was far, far worse than anything that had been chasing me through the forest. The interior of the cabin was a nightmare made manifest. Shadows clung to every corner, writhing and pulsing with an otherworldly life of their own. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something alien and indescribable that made my stomach churn. But it was the walls that truly horrified me. Every inch of available space was covered in symbols and markings, carved deep into the wood. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, twisting eldritch shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Some seemed to move when I wasn't looking at them, rearranging themselves into new and terrible configurations. In the center of the room stood a crude altar, its surface stained dark with what I prayed was just rust or mold. Atop it sat a book, ancient and ponderous, its cover fashioned from some material I couldn't identify. It didn't look like leather or any other animal hide I'd ever seen. The texture was all wrong, almost as if it were alive. I knew I should turn and run to flee this place of nightmares and never look back. But something compelled me forward, drawing me inexorably toward the altar and the book that rested upon it. My hands shook as I reached out to touch the cover, my fingertips barely grazing its surface. The moment I made contact, a jolt of energy surged through me. Images flashed behind my eyes, too fast to comprehend, but leaving me with a sense of cosmic dread that threatened to overwhelm my sanity. I saw vast dark spaces between the stars. I saw creatures of impossible geometry, their very existence an affront to the laws of physics. And I saw Seabrook Haven, the quiet coastal town that had been my destination, wreathed in shadows and writhing tentacles. I jerked my hand away with a strangled cry, stumbling backward until I collided with the far wall. The symbols carved there seemed to burn against my skin, branding me with their eldritch knowledge. I could feel them seeping into my mind, whispering secrets that no human was meant to know. A sound from outside snapped me back to reality. The growl I had heard in the forest had returned, louder and more menacing than ever. It was joined by others, a chorus of inhuman voices that surrounded the cabin. Whatever was out there, it had found me. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes fell on a rusted fireplace poker leaning against the hearth. I snatched it up, its weight providing little comfort against the horrors that awaited me. The door began to shake, the rotted wood groaning under the assault of whatever was trying to get in. I backed away, my grip tightening on the poker until my knuckles turned white. The whispers returned, filling my head with their maddening chant. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. I didn't belong here. I was an intruder in a place where reality itself held no sway. With a splintering crash, the door gave way. A shape filled the doorway, but my mind refused to process what I was seeing. It was as if my eyes and brain were working against each other, unable to reconcile the impossible geometry of the thing that stood before me. I lashed out blindly with the poker, feeling it connect with something solid. There was a screech of pain and fury, and then I was moving. I dove through the shattered doorway, rolling down the rotted steps and onto the forest floor. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. The forest was alive with movement now. Shadows danced between the trees, always just out of sight. The whispers had become a roar, drowning out the sound of my own ragged breathing. I ran until my legs felt like they were on fire, until each breath was a knife in my lungs. And then, miraculously, I burst out of the tree line and found myself back at the overlook. My car sat where I had left it, a beacon of normality in a world gone mad. I threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys as I tried to start the engine. It roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking area, gravel spraying behind me. As I sped down the winding road back to the highway, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed behind me, dark and forbidding, and for just a moment I thought I saw something move at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, with eyes that glowed like embers in the gathering dusk. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't slow down until I reached the highway, the comforting glow of my headlights illuminating the road ahead. But even as I merged back into traffic, heading towards Seabrook Haven, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever I had encountered in that cabin, whatever dark forces were at work in these woods, they weren't done with me yet. The whispers lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the horrors I had witnessed. And as the miles ticked by, I found myself wondering if I was driving towards safety or straight into the belly of the beast. The remainder of my drive to Seabrook Haven passed in a blur of paranoia and barely contained panic. Every shadow on the road seemed to reach for my car. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. I kept expecting to see that tall, thin figure materialize in my rearview mirror, its ember eyes boring into my soul. It was well past midnight when I finally saw the sign welcoming me to Seabrook Haven. The relief I felt was palpable, but short-lived. As I drove down the main street, the wrongness I had felt in the forest seemed to permeate the very air of the town. The streets were deserted, which wasn't unusual given the late hour. But there was something off about the emptiness. It felt deliberate, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The streetlights cast pools of sickly yellow light, and in between those pools the darkness seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of its own. I pulled up to the small motel where I had made my reservation. The neon vacancy sign flickered erratically, casting an eerie, intermittent glow across the nearly empty parking lot. As I cut the engine, the silence pressed in around me like a physical force. No crickets chirped, no distant dogs barked. Just the oppressive quiet and the faint buzz of the neon sign. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the office, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the cracked asphalt. A bell jangled discordantly as I pushed open the door, making me jump. The man behind the counter looked up from a dog-eared paperback, his rheumy eyes regarding me with a mixture of suspicion and, was that pity? Checking in? He asked, his voice a dry rasp that set my teeth on edge. I nodded, giving him my name. As he flipped through a ledger, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, carved into the edge of the counter, was one of the symbols I had seen in the cabin. I blinked hard, sure I must be imagining things. But when I looked again, it was still there, its lines seeming to writhe and shift under my gaze. Everything all right? The clerk asked, eyeing me warily. I forced a smile, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice as I replied, "Yes, just tired from the drive. Long day on the road." He grunted non-committally and handed me a key attached to a faded plastic fob. "Room 13, he said, and I couldn't suppress a shudder at the number. End of the row facing the beach. I thanked him and hurried out, eager to be away from his unsettling gaze and that impossible symbol. The cool night air did little to calm my nerves as I made my way to my room. The key stuck in the lock, requiring several attempts before the door finally swung open with a protesting creak. The room was small and shabby, with water stains on the ceiling and peeling wallpaper in the corners. But it was a far cry from the horrors of the forest cabin, and for that I was grateful. I dropped my bag on the bed and sank into the room's single chair, my body suddenly feeling like it was made of lead. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the events of the day crashed over me like a tidal wave. I found myself shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face as I struggled to make sense of what I had experienced. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination, a trick of an overworked mind combined with the isolation of the forest. But the vivid memories of the symbols, the whispers, and that thing in the doorway were too real to dismiss. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in my thoughts and fears. When I finally stirred, I realized that pale light was beginning to filter through the thin curtains. I had spent the entire night reliving my nightmare. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, desperate to connect with something normal, something from my old life. But as the screen lit up, my heart sank. No signal. I was cut off, alone in this strange town that already felt more like a trap than a vacation destination. I forced myself to my feet, wincing at the stiffness in my muscles. A shower, I decided. A hot shower would help clear my head and wash away some of the lingering dread that clung to me like a second skin. The bathroom was as dated as the rest of the room, with cracked tiles and a mirror spotted with age. As I waited for the water to heat up, I caught sight of my reflection and barely recognized myself. My eyes were bloodshot, dark circles standing out starkly against my pale skin, and there, just visible above the collar of my shirt, was a mark I didn't remember getting. It looked almost like a bruise, but the shape was too regular, too deliberate. With growing horror, I realized it was one of the symbols from the cabin, somehow branded into my flesh. I stumbled back from the mirror, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe I had scratched myself in my sleep. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the mark remained, a constant reminder that what I had experienced was all too real. The shower did little to calm my nerves. The water pressure was weak, and the temperature fluctuated wildly between scalding and freezing. As I stood under the sputtering stream, I could have sworn I heard whispers again, barely audible beneath the sound of running water. I shut it off quickly, straining my ears in the sudden silence. Nothing. Just the drip of the faucet and my own ragged breathing. I dressed quickly, not wanting to spend another moment in the claustrophobic confines of the motel room. Perhaps some fresh air and daylight would help dispel the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over everything. As I stepped outside, I was struck by how normal everything looked in the light of day. The sun shone brightly, and a cool breeze carried the salt tang of the nearby ocean. People walked up and down the street, going about their morning routines. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it had all been a bad dream after all. But as I made my way down the street, that hope began to fade. I noticed things. Small details that seemed innocuous at first but gradually built into a picture of wrongness. The way people's eyes slid past me as if they were deliberately avoiding eye contact. The hushed conversations that stopped abruptly as I approached. And there, in the cornerstone of a building, another one of those symbols, weathered with age but unmistakable. I found myself in front of a small cafe, my stomach growling despite my unease. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and several patrons looked up from their meals. Their gazes lingered a beat too long, their expressions unreadable. I settled into a booth in the corner, trying to make myself as inconspicuous as possible. A waitress approached, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "What can I get for you, honey?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. I ordered coffee and toast, my appetite suddenly diminished. As she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the cafe was watching me, their eyes boring into my back. The murmur of conversation seemed to ebb and flow, and more than once I caught snippets that made my skin crawl. Came in late last night. Went up to the overlook. Marked now. Poor thing. I hunched lower in my seat, trying to block out the whispers. When the waitress returned with my order, I noticed a tattoo on her wrist, partially hidden by her sleeve. My blood ran cold as I recognized yet another of the eldritch symbols I had seen in the cabin. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, noticing my stare. "You look a bit pale. Long night?" I nodded mutely, not trusting myself to speak. She lingered for a moment, as if waiting for something, then moved away with a small shrug. I forced myself to eat, each bite tasting like ash in my mouth. I had to get out of here, to leave this town and never look back. But even as I thought it, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Whatever force had drawn me here, whatever dark power was at work in Seabrook Haven, it wasn't going to let me go without a fight. As I left the cafe, my eyes were drawn to the beach across the street. The waves lapped gently at the shore, and a few early morning joggers made their way along the water's edge. It looked peaceful, inviting even, but as I watched, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, just beneath the surface of the water, I could have sworn I saw movement, not the normal motion of waves and currents, but something large, something that had no business being in the shallow waters of a beach town. I blinked, and it was gone. But the image remained burned into my mind, a vast dark shape, all writhing tentacles and impossible angles. And in that moment, I knew with sickening certainty that the horror I had encountered in the forest was only the beginning. Seabrook Haven held secrets far darker and more terrible than I could have imagined, and somehow, I had become entangled in them. I turned away from the beach, my mind racing. I needed answers, and I needed them now. But where could I turn? Who could I trust in a town where everyone seemed to be part of some vast unspoken conspiracy? As I walked aimlessly down the street, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, I realized that I had never felt more alone or more afraid in my entire life. As the day wore on, I found myself wandering the streets of Seabrook Haven in a daze, my mind struggling to process everything I had seen and experienced. The town seemed to shift and change around me, familiar sights taking on sinister undertones with each passing hour. I eventually found myself in front of the local library, a squat brick building that looked like it had seen better days. Something compelled me to enter, a nagging feeling that if answers existed, they might be found within those weathered walls. The interior was dimly lit and smelled of old paper and dust. Rows of bookshelves stretched into shadowy recesses, and the few patrons I saw moved silently between them, their faces obscured. I approached the front desk, where an elderly librarian peered at me over half-moon spectacles. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, unsure of how to articulate what I was looking for without sounding completely insane. Finally, I managed to stammer out, "I'm researching the history of Seabrook Haven, particularly any unusual events or legends." The librarian's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Local history section is in the back," she said, gesturing vaguely. "You might find what you're looking for there." As I made my way to the indicated section, I couldn't shake the feeling that the librarian's eyes were following me, boring into my back with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The local history shelves were tucked away in a corner, illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent light. As I perused the titles, one book caught my eye. Seabrook Haven, A History Unspoken by Edwin Marsh. I pulled the tome from the shelf, a cloud of dust billowing up as I did so. The cover was nondescript, but as I opened it, a slip of paper fell out. I bent to retrieve it, my blood running cold as I saw what was written there in spidery handwriting. "The truth lies beneath the waves. Beware the whispers of the deep." With trembling hands, I began to leaf through the book. Most of it seemed innocuous enough, dry accounts of the town's founding, economic developments, and local personalities. But as I delved deeper, I began to notice inconsistencies, strange gaps in the historical record that the author seemed to dance around without ever directly addressing. And then I found it, a chapter near the end titled "The Incident of 1924. As I read, my horror grew. The account was vague and clearly sanitized, but the implications were chilling. It spoke of a great storm that had battered the coast, of strange lights seen beneath the waves, and of an entire fishing fleet that had vanished without a trace. In the aftermath, dozens of townspeople were reported missing, and those who remained spoke in hushed tones of visitors from the deep and bargains struck in blood. I was so engrossed in my reading that I didn't notice the approach of, footsteps until a hand fell heavily on my shoulder. I yelped, the book tumbling from my grasp as I spun around. An old man stood there, his weathered face etched with deep lines and his eyes clouded with cataracts. But despite his apparent blindness, I had the distinct impression that he was seeing me more clearly than anyone else in this god-forsaken town. "You shouldn't be reading that," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Some knowledge is best left buried." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you know about all this?" The old man's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "I know that you're marked, just like I was all those years ago. I know that they're watching you, waiting. And I know that if you're smart, you'll get in your car and drive as far away from here as you can and never look back." "But what are they?" I pressed, desperate for answers. "What's happening in this town?" The old man leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear as he whispered, "They are the old ones, child. The dwellers in the deep. The keepers of secrets that would shatter your sanity. And they hunger. Oh, how they hunger." A chill ran down my spine and I opened my mouth to ask more, but the old man was already shuffling away, disappearing between the bookshelves as silently as he had appeared. I turned back to retrieve the fallen book, but to my shock it was gone. The shelf where I had found it was empty, as if Seabrook Haven, A History Unspoken, had never existed. I stumbled out of the library, my mind reeling. The sunlight seemed too bright, too harsh after the gloom of the stacks. As I stood on the sidewalk trying to gather my thoughts, I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. Across the street, partially hidden in the shadow of an alley, stood a familiar figure, tall, impossibly thin, with eyes that smoldered like embers in the gloom. The same figure I had glimpsed at the edge of the forest. Our eyes met, and in that moment I felt the weight of eons press down upon me. Ancient alien intelligences brushed against my consciousness, their vast inhuman thoughts threatening to overwhelm my sanity. I saw visions of cyclopean cities beneath the waves, of rituals performed in lightless depths, of sacrifices made to entities so vast and terrible that the human mind couldn't begin to comprehend them. And then, mercifully, I passed out. When I came to, I was lying on a bench in a small park with no memory of how I had gotten there. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire. As I sat up, groaning at the pounding in my head, I realized that something had changed. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the town seemed to have intensified, as if the very air was charged with malevolent energy. People hurried past on the sidewalk, their heads down and their pace quick. No one met my gaze or acknowledged my presence. In the distance, I could hear the sound of waves crashing against the shore. But there was something off about the rhythm, something unnatural that sent shivers down my spine. As I stumbled to my feet, I knew with grim certainty that I was running out of time. Whatever dark forces were at work in Seabrook Haven, they were gathering strength, preparing for something. And somehow I had become a part of it all, a pawn in a cosmic game whose rules I couldn't begin to fathom. I had to find a way out, to break free from the insidious grip of this cursed town. But as the last rays of sunlight faded and shadows began to lengthen, stretching towards me like grasping fingers, I feared it might already be too late. The night was falling, and with it I sensed the approach of horrors beyond imagining. The true face of Seabrook Haven was about to reveal itself, and I was terrified of what I might see. As night fell over Seabrook Haven, the town seemed to come alive with an otherworldly energy. The streets, which had been eerily quiet during the day, now thrummed with a palpable tension. Shadows deepened and writhed, taking on shapes that defied rational explanation. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying with it the briny scent of the sea mixed with something else, something ancient and wrong. I made my way back to the motel, my feet carrying me almost of their own accord. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get in my car and drive until Seabrook Haven was nothing but a distant nightmare. But something held me back, a combination of morbid curiosity and the growing certainty that escape was no longer possible. As I approached my room, I noticed a group of people gathered in the parking lot. They stood in a loose circle, their heads bowed and their voices a low murmur that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was familiar. The same eldritch language I had heard whispered in the forest. I tried to slip past unnoticed, but as I reached for my door, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, coming face to face with the motel clerk. His rheumy eyes now blazed with an inner fire, and his grip was far stronger than his frail appearance would suggest. "It's time," he said, his voice resonating with an authority that brooked no argument. "They are calling and you must answer." Before I could react, two more figures emerged from the shadows, grasping my arms with inhuman strength. I struggled, but it was useless. They began to drag me towards the beach, the group from the parking lot falling in behind us in a macabre procession. As we neared the shore, I saw that we weren't alone. Streams of people were converging on the beach from all directions, their faces blank and their movements unnaturally fluid. The whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus that seemed to make the very air vibrate. At the water's edge, I saw what looked like an altar made of driftwood and seaweed, adorned with symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Standing before it was a figure in robes that seemed to absorb the darkness around them. As we drew closer, the figure turned and I had to bite back a scream. The face beneath the hood was barely human, its features fluid and shifting like the surface of a troubled sea. Eyes that were too large, too knowing, fixed upon me with an intensity that threatened to shatter my sanity. "The chosen one has arrived," the figure intoned, its voice somehow both a whisper and a roar. "The offering that will bridge the gap between worlds." I was forced to my knees before the altar, the cold surf lapping at my legs. The robed figure produced a knife, its blade dark and oily in the moonlight. As it raised the weapon, the chanting reached a fever pitch, and the waters beyond the breakers began to churn and boil. Something was rising from the depths, something vast and ancient and utterly alien. Tentacles the size of redwoods broke the surface, their suckered undersides glistening obscenely in the moonlight. The water churned and frothed as more of the creature emerged, its bulk defying comprehension. I caught glimpses of eyes larger than houses, of a maw lined with teeth like jagged mountains, of flesh that seemed to shift and flow like living oil. The sight of it threatened to break my mind. I felt a scream building in my throat, but no sound came out. My entire body trembled, caught between the primal urge to flee and the paralyzing terror that locked my muscles in place. The robed figures chanting rose to a crescendo, the knife glinting as it descended towards my chest. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw the blade inching closer, felt the icy grip of hands holding me in place, heard the thunderous heartbeat of the monstrosity rising from the sea. And then, in a burst of desperate strength, I moved. I threw myself sideways, the knife slicing a shallow cut across my arm instead of plunging into my heart. The sudden movement caught my captors off guard, and I managed to wrench free from their grasp. I scrambled to my feet, salt water and blood stinging my eyes as I ran. Shouts of anger and frustration erupted behind me, quickly drowned out by a sound that defied description, a roar that was part whale song, part thunderclap and part the grinding of tectonic plates. The very air seemed to vibrate with its fury. I ran blindly up the beach, my feet slipping on wet sand and sharp shells. The darkness was alive around me, shadows reaching out with grasping tendrils. Everywhere I looked, I saw eyes, in the windows of houses, in the spaces between trees, in the very stars themselves. The whole universe seemed to be watching, waiting to see if I would escape or be dragged back into the maw of that cosmic horror. As I reached the edge of the beach, I risked a glance back. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. The entire town was in motion, every resident of Seabrook Haven moving as one towards me. Their faces were masks of inhuman hunger, eyes glowing with an inner light that spoke of possession by forces beyond mortal ken. And behind them, rising ever higher from the churning sea, was the entity. Its full form was mercifully hidden by distance and darkness, but what I could see was enough to send fresh waves of terror coursing through me. Tentacles thick as sequoias lashed the air, and a shape blotted out the stars. A shape that hurt to look at, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my mind could process. I turned and ran harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning and my muscles screaming in protest. I had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between myself and the horrors behind me. The streets of Seabrook Haven had become a nightmare labyrinth. Buildings loomed at impossible angles, their architecture twisting in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. Shadows moved independently of their casters, and more than once I found myself doubling back, the geography of the town shifting like quicksand beneath my feet. All the while, I could hear them behind me. The sound of hundreds of feet moving in perfect unison, the whispered chants in that blasphemous language, and underneath it all, the deep, bone-shaking rumble of something vast and hungry drawing ever closer. I don't know how long I ran, or how many times I narrowly avoided the grasping hands of my pursuers. Time had lost all meaning, stretching and compressing like a funhouse mirror. My world had narrowed to the pounding of my heart, the rasp of breath in my lungs, and the constant, gnawing terror that spurred me onward. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, when my legs were about to give out and my sanity was hanging by the thinnest of threads, I saw it. My car still parked in front of the motel where this nightmare had begun, a beacon of hope in a sea of madness. With a final burst of speed, I closed the distance. My hands shook violently as I fumbled for my keys, dropping them once before managing to jam them into the lock. I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as the first of my pursuers reached the parking lot. The key turned in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing as I backed out. Faces pressed against the windows, hands clawed at the doors, but I didn't stop. I shifted into drive and floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward with a screech of protesting metal. Bodies thumped against the hood, rolled across the roof. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The road ahead was a blur, my vision tunneling as I pushed the car to its limits. In the rearview mirror, I could see the mass of townspeople receding, but above them loomed a shape that filled the sky. a silhouette of such cosmic wrongness that I felt my grasp on reality slipping just from that brief glimpse. I drove recklessly, taking turns at dangerous speeds, the tires squealing in protest. Every shadow on the road looked like a grasping tentacle, every tree like a reaching arm trying to pull me back. The whispers still echoed in my head, growing fainter with each mile but never fully fading. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky that I allowed myself to slow down. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my whole body trembling with exhaustion and residual terror. I had no idea where I was or how far I'd driven. All I knew was that Seabrook Haven was behind me, and with it the horrors I had witnessed. But as I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. There, just visible above my collar, was the mark, the eldritch symbol that had been branded into my flesh. And in that moment, I knew with sickening certainty that it wasn't over. Whatever I had become entangled with in that cursed town, whatever cosmic game I had unwittingly become a part of, it wasn't finished with me. I pressed down on the accelerator once more, my eyes darting nervously between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Seabrook Haven was behind me, yes, but its shadow still clung to me. Its whispers still echoed in the recesses of my mind, and somewhere out there in the vast, uncaring universe, ancient and terrible things were stirring. I drove on, chasing the rising sun, knowing that I could never truly outrun the darkness that now lived inside me. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and with it the promise of more nightmares to come. For once you've glimpsed the true face of reality, once you've heard the whispers of the deep and seen the shape of things that lurk beyond the veil, there's no going back. There's only the road, the endless night, and the growing certainty that someday, somehow, the horrors of Seabrook Haven would find me again. Days blurred into weeks as I drove, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Seabrook Haven. I avoided major highways and populated areas, sticking to back roads and sleeping in my car at remote rest stops. Paranoia was my constant companion. Every stranger's glance felt loaded with hidden meaning. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. The mark on my neck refused to fade. Some days it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, sending tendrils of icy pain through my body. Other times it burned like a brand, as if trying to remind me that I could never truly escape what I had experienced. Sleep, when it came, was plagued by nightmares. I dreamed of vast sunless oceans and cities built of non-Euclidean geometry. I saw things with too many eyes and not enough mouths, heard languages that human vocal cords were never meant to produce. And always there was the sense of something vast and hungry watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was during one of these fitful bouts of sleep, parked at a deserted overlook somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, that things took a turn for the worse. I was jolted awake by a sound I had hoped never to hear again, that low, alien whisper that had haunted me since the forest outside Seabrook Haven. My eyes snapped open, darting wildly around the car's interior. Nothing seemed out of place, but the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing second. With trembling hands, I started the engine and peeled out of the overlook. Gravel sprang behind me as I accelerated down the winding mountain road. The whispers followed, somehow emanating from everywhere and nowhere at once. They filled the car, drowning out the roar of the engine and the screech of tires on asphalt. My head throbbed as I tried to make sense of the sounds, my brain instinctively trying to parse meaning from the eldritch syllables. And then, to my horror, I realized I could understand them. "You cannot run," they said, their voices a cacophony of hisses and gurgles. "You are marked. You are ours. The depths call and you must answer." "No," I screamed, slamming my palm against the steering wheel. "Leave me alone. I want no part of this." But my protests fell on deaf ears. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The mark on my neck flared with pain and I felt a tugging sensation, as if hooks had been embedded in my very soul. I was so distracted by the voices and the pain that I almost didn't see the figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing as I swerved to avoid a collision. As I skidded to a stop, my headlights illuminated the impossible. It was the robed figure from the beach, the one who had tried to sacrifice me. But here, hundreds of miles from the ocean, its form had changed. Its robe seemed to be made of living shadows, constantly shifting and flowing. Where its face should have been was a swirling vortex of darkness, punctuated by pinpricks of light like distant stars. "You cannot escape your destiny," it said. its voice resonating in my skull rather than my ears. The old ones have chosen you. You will be the key that opens the way. I threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. I turned the key frantically, but nothing happened. The figure began to approach, each step leaving a patch of twisted alien growth in its wake. Trees warped and writhed, their bark taking on the texture of scales. The very rocks seemed to bleed, oozing a thick black ichor. In desperation, I flung open the car door and ran. The mountain path stretched out before me, winding through trees that now looked more like towering tentacles than anything that had ever grown on Earth. The whispers had become a roar, filling the air with promises of power and threats of unimaginable torment. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I could go no further, I collapsed against a boulder, gasping for breath. As I sat there trying to gather my wits, I noticed something odd about the rock I was leaning against. Its surface was covered in familiar symbols, the same eldritch markings I had seen in the cabin and throughout Seabrook Haven. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I realized that I hadn't escaped at all. Somehow, impossibly, the influence of Seabrook Haven and whatever cosmic horrors it served had spread. Or perhaps it had always been here, hidden just beneath the surface of reality, waiting for someone like me to awaken it. A twig snapped behind me and I whirled around. The robed figure stood there, its form seeming to blend with the shadows of the forest. All around us, the trees creaked and groaned, their branches reaching towards me like grasping hands. "It is time," the figure intoned. "The stars are right and the way must be opened." As it spoke, the ground began to tremble. A fissure opened up at my feet, widening rapidly into a chasm that stretched as far as I could see in either direction. From its depths came a sound, a low pulsing throb that I felt in my bones more than heard. I stood frozen on the edge, caught between the advancing figure and the yawning abyss. The whispers had returned, but now they were joined by other voices, deep, resonant tones that spoke of ages past and futures yet to come. They promised knowledge beyond human comprehension, power to reshape reality itself. All I had to do was take one step forward, to embrace my destiny as the opener of ways. Part of me, a part that had grown stronger since my time in Seabrook Haven, yearned to accept. To dive into that cosmic abyss and become one with the vast alien intelligences that dwelled there. But another part, the part that still clung to my humanity, recoiled in terror. I stood there, teetering on the brink of madness and transcendence, as the very fabric of reality warped and twisted around me. The decision I made in that moment would not just determine my fate, but potentially the fate of all humanity. And as the chasm widened and the whispers grew to a deafening roar, I made my choice. Time seemed to stretch into infinity as I stood on the precipice, the yawning chasm before me and the robed figure behind. The whispers had become a cacophony, a storm of eldritch voices that threatened to shatter my sanity. Every fiber of my being vibrated with the terrible knowledge that had been forced upon me, with the weight of the choice I now faced. In that moment of cosmic horror and terrible clarity, I understood that there was no escape. The mark on my neck pulsed in time with the throbbing from the abyss, a constant reminder that I had been changed, irrevocably linked to forces beyond human comprehension. Whatever I chose, there would be no going back to the blissful ignorance of my former life. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and made my decision. I turned to face the robed figure, my voice steadier than I felt as I spoke. "I won't be your puppet. I won't open the way for your masters. If this is my destiny, then I reject it." The figure's shadowy form seemed to ripple with anger. "You have no choice," it hissed, its voice a maelstrom of alien tones. "You are marked. You are chosen. The way must be opened." "No," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "I may be marked, but I still have free will, and I choose to fight." With those words, something shifted. The air crackled with energy, and I felt a surge of power coursing through my veins. The mark on my neck burned white-hot, but instead of pain, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The robed figure lunged forward, shadows extending from its form like tentacles. But as they reached for me, I raised my hands instinctively. Light erupted from my palms, a brilliant, blinding radiance that sent the shadows reeling back. I stared at my hands in shock, watching as symbols similar to the one on my neck danced across my skin, glowing with an inner light. Somehow, impossibly, I had turned the mark's power against itself. The figure shrieked, a sound that threatened to rupture my eardrums. "What have you done?" it wailed. The gift was not meant to be used this way. Understanding dawned on me. The mark wasn't just a brand of ownership. It was a conduit for power. Power that could be used to open the way for the old ones, or to seal it shut. With newfound determination, I advanced on the figure. Each step I took seemed to strengthen me, the light emanating from my body growing brighter. The twisted landscape around us began to revert, eldritch growths withering and alien geometry straightening. The robed figure backed away, its form flickering like a faulty hologram. "You cannot undo what has been set in motion," it snarled, but I could hear the fear in its voice. "Watch me," I growled. I reached out and grasped the figure's robe. The moment my glowing hands touched the living shadows, there was a thunderous crack. Reality itself seemed to splinter, and I was falling, tumbling through a maelstrom of light and darkness. Visions assaulted me. Ancient cities rising from the depths, tentacled horrors drifting through the void between stars, civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye. I saw the true history of Earth, the countless times it had been visited, colonized, and abandoned by entities so vast and alien that humanity's entire existence was nothing but a footnote in their unfathomable lifespans. And through it all, I saw Seabrook Haven. Not just the town as it existed now, but as it had been throughout history. I saw it as a prehistoric settlement where early humans performed rituals to appease the things that dwelled in the deep. I saw it as a colonial outpost, its founders making dark pacts with forces they couldn't comprehend. And I saw its future, countless possible futures where the old ones rose and humanity fell, where reality itself was warped and reshaped to suit the whims of cosmic horrors. The visions threatened to overwhelm me, to drown my consciousness in an ocean of terrible knowledge, but I clung to my sense of self, to the spark of defiance that had led me to this point. The mark on my neck burned hotter than ever, but now it felt like a source of strength rather than a brand of ownership. With a supreme effort of will, I began to push back against the tide of visions. I focused on the here and now, on the mountainside where this final confrontation had begun. Slowly, agonizingly, reality began to reassert itself around me. I found myself back on solid ground, still grasping the robed figure's shadowy form. But now the roles were reversed. The figure writhed in my grip, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The light emanating from my body had grown so intense that it hurt to look at directly, burning away the eldritch corruption that had taken root in the landscape. "What are you doing?" The figure shrieked, its voice a cacophony of terror and rage. "You'll destroy everything. The order of the cosmos. The order of the cosmos can go to hell," I snarled, tightening my grip. "I'm shutting this down. All of it." I don't know where the words came from or how I knew what to do, but as I spoke I felt power surging through me. The symbols on my skin flared brighter, and I began to chant in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood perfectly. It was the language of creation and destruction, of binding and unmaking. The chasm at my feet began to close, the earth knitting itself back together. The twisted trees straightened, their bark returning to normal. Even the air seemed to clear, the oppressive atmosphere of cosmic dread dissipating like morning fog. The robed figure's form was almost completely gone now, little more than a wisp of shadow in my grasp. Its voice, once so powerful and terrifying, had been reduced to a pitiful whimper. "You don't know what you're doing," it pleaded. "The old ones will not be denied. They will find another way, another opener." "Not if I have anything to say about it," I growled. With a final surge of power, I completed the chant. There was a blinding flash of light, a sound like reality itself tearing, and then silence. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. The robed figure was gone, along with any trace of the eldritch corruption that had tainted the land. The forest around me looked normal, just an ordinary stretch of Appalachian wilderness under a star-filled sky. But I knew it wasn't over. What I had done here was just the beginning. The knowledge I had gained, the power I now wielded, it came with a responsibility. Seabrook Haven wasn't the only place where the veil between worlds was thin, where cosmic horrors sought entrance to our reality. As I struggled to my feet, my body aching from the ordeal, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't go back to my old life, couldn't pretend that I hadn't seen behind the curtain of reality. But I could use what I had learned, use this terrible gift I had been given to protect others from the fate that had nearly befallen me. I made my way back to my car, which sat undamaged on the mountain road. As I slid behind the wheel, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes glowed faintly with an inner light, and the mark on my neck had changed. It was still there, but now it looked less like a brand and more like a badge. I started the engine, my mind already turning to the task ahead. There would be other towns like Seabrook Haven, other cults and cosmic entities trying to break through into our world, and I would be there to stop them. As I drove off into the night, leaving the mountain and its secrets behind, I allowed myself a grim smile. The road ahead would be long and fraught with dangers I could scarcely imagine, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of purpose. The whispers of Seabrook Haven still echoed in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. But now instead of terror, they filled me with determination. I was no longer prey. I was the hunter, and the things that go bump in the night had better start watching their backs. In the months that followed my confrontation on the mountain, I crisscrossed the country, following a trail of eldritch whispers and cosmic disturbances that only I could perceive. The mark on my neck served as both compass and warning system, pulsing with ethereal energy whenever I neared a nexus of otherworldly activity. I found myself in forgotten towns and bustling cities alike, always arriving just in time to prevent some unspeakable horror from breaking through into our reality. Sometimes it was a cult, their minds warped by forbidden knowledge attempting to summon their dark gods. Other times it was a solitary figure, not unlike the robed entity I had faced, serving as an agent for forces beyond human comprehension. Each encounter left its mark, both physically and mentally. New symbols appeared on my skin, a growing tapestry of eldritch power that I was slowly learning to control. And with each victory, each averted catastrophe, I gained new insights into the vast, uncaring universe that lurked just beyond the thin veil of what we call reality. But the toll was heavy. I couldn't maintain connections, couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. The things I fought, the cosmic entities that sought entrance to our world, they were patient. They had waited eons for their chance. They could afford to bide their time. And so I kept moving, a lone sentinel standing against the encroaching darkness. It was during one of these nomadic periods, as I drove through the rain-soaked streets of a small Midwestern town, that I received a sign I couldn't ignore. The mark on my neck flared with pain so intense it nearly caused me to crash the car. As I pulled over, gasping for breath, I saw it in the rearview mirror. The symbol was changing, shifting into a pattern I had seen only once before. Seabrook Haven was calling. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, a war of emotions raging within me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep driving in the opposite direction and never look back, but I knew I couldn't. Whatever was happening in that cursed town, it was big, possibly bigger than anything I had faced since that night on the mountain. The drive back to the coast was a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days. With each mile that brought me closer to Seabrook Haven, the whispers in my mind grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of ancient prophecies, of cosmic alignments, of a convergence that would tear asunder the barriers between worlds. As I crested the final hill and saw the town spread out before me, my breath caught in my throat. Seabrook Haven had changed. Gone was the quaint coastal village that had lured me in all those months ago. In its place stood a nightmare made manifest. The buildings twisted at impossible angles, their architecture an affront to Euclidean geometry. The streets writhed like living things, pulsing with an otherworldly light. And dominating it all, rising from the churning waters of the bay, was a structure that defied description. A vast, cyclopean edifice of alien design that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. I parked at the outskirts of town, my hands shaking as I cut the engine. The whispers had become a roar, a cacophony of eldritch voices that threatened to overwhelm my sanity, but I pushed them back, drawing on the power I had gained in my months of battling cosmic horrors. As I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of destiny settling upon my shoulders. This was it, the moment everything had been leading up to. The final confrontation between humanity's lone defender and the forces that sought to remake reality in their own twisted image. I took a deep breath, centering myself as I had learned to do in the face of mind-bending terror. The symbols on my skin began to glow, casting a protective aura around me as I took my first steps into the warped landscape of Seabrook Haven. Whatever horrors awaited me in the heart of this cosmic maelstrom, I was ready. The whispers of Seabrook Haven had set me on this path, had transformed me from an ordinary person into something more, and now as I walked into the belly of the beast, I silently vowed that I would see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. The fate of not just Seabrook Haven but of all reality hung in the balance, and I was the only one who could tip the scales.